How to Think, Speak, and Influence Like a Pro. Full audiobook. Hook. A few years ago, a young architect named Michael walked into the most important meeting of his career. For weeks, he had prepared every slide. He had memorized every statistic. He knew every detail of the project better than anyone else in the company. 20 executives sat around a long conference table. At the far end of the room, the CEO looked up from his notes and smiled. "Whenever you're ready." Michael stood. He took one slow breath, and then everything inside his mind became noise. His thoughts collided with one another. The first sentence came out awkwardly. He tried to fix it by explaining more. Then he explained the explanation. Every new sentence became longer than the last. 5 minutes passed. No one interrupted him. No one challenged him. But something worse happened. People stopped listening. Some looked at their laptops. One executive quietly checked his phone. Another began writing emails. Michael had entered that room with one brilliant idea. He left feeling as though he had never expressed it at all. Later that afternoon, he found his mentor sitting alone in the cafeteria. "I don't understand," Michael admitted. "I knew everything about the project." His mentor nodded. "I know. So why couldn't I convince anyone?" The older man smiled gently before answering. "Because knowledge isn't what people hear." Michael frowned. "They hear clarity." He paused. "And today, you had plenty of knowledge, but almost no clarity." Those words stayed with Michael for years, because he eventually discovered something that most people never realize. The greatest communicators aren't necessarily the smartest people in the room. They aren't always the loudest. They aren't always the funniest. And they certainly aren't always the most charismatic. What separates them is something much simpler. They think before they speak. They choose their words with intention. They understand when silence is more powerful than another sentence. And when they finally do speak, people listen. Not because they have to, but because every word feels deliberate. Most people believe communication is simply the ability to talk well. But real influence begins long before the first word leaves your mouth. It begins with the way you organize your thoughts, the way you manage your emotions, the way you control your voice, the way you guide another person's attention without forcing it. Influence isn't about sounding impressive. It's about making people feel that following your words is the safest direction to take. Throughout this audiobook, you'll discover 10 essential principles that transform ordinary communication into genuine influence. You'll learn how to think with greater clarity, how to develop a calm, authoritative voice, how to choose words that carry real weight, how to structure your ideas like a leader, how to guide people toward action, how to master your emotional tone, how to build trust, how to use silence as a strategic advantage, how to read the emotional energy of every room, and finally, how to turn all of these skills into lifelong habits. None of these abilities require natural talent. They don't belong only to gifted speakers. They belong to anyone willing to practice them consistently. Because every confident speaker, every respected leader, every unforgettable communicator started exactly where you are now, with uncertainty, with hesitation, with a voice that still had room to grow. So before we begin, I want you to make one simple promise to yourself. For the next hour, don't listen to these ideas as theory. Listen for the one habit, the one sentence, or the one realization that could completely change the way you speak for the rest of your life. Because sometimes one clear thought can transform every conversation that follows. And with that, let's begin where every great communicator begins. Not with speaking, but with thinking. Chapter 1. Think clearly before you speak. A few minutes before the board meeting began, Emma sat alone in the conference room, staring at the first slide of her presentation. She had worked on it for nearly 2 weeks. Every chart was accurate. Every number had been verified. Every possible question had been anticipated. She wasn't unprepared. In fact, she was probably the most prepared person in the building. One by one, the executives entered the room. Coffee cups touched the table. Laptops opened. Quiet conversations filled the air. Finally, the CEO looked toward her. "Whenever you're ready." Emma stood. Her heart began beating faster. She smiled politely. Then she started speaking. Within seconds, something unexpected happened. Her mind raced faster than her mouth. She tried to explain the background before explaining the idea. Halfway through, she remembered another important point, so she interrupted herself. Then she realized she had skipped something. She went backward, then forward again. 5 minutes later, she was still talking, but no one could tell what her main point actually was. The meeting ended with polite applause. Not a single executive challenged her idea, not because they agreed, but because they never truly understood it. That evening, her manager called her into his office. "You know," he said gently, "your proposal was excellent." Emma looked confused. "It didn't sound excellent. It wasn't your idea that failed." He leaned forward. "It was your thinking." She frowned. "I don't understand." "You were trying to organize your thoughts while speaking. You should have organized them before speaking." That single sentence changed the way she communicated forever. Because most communication problems aren't actually communication problems. They're thinking problems. And until your thoughts become clear, your words never will. Most people believe communication begins the moment they open their mouth. It doesn't. Communication begins much earlier. It begins in silence, in that invisible space where your mind decides what truly matters, what deserves to be said, and what should be left unsaid. Every remarkable communicator you admire, whether they're a business leader, a great teacher, a skilled negotiator, or someone who simply has a natural ability to hold a room, starts in exactly the same place, not with words, but with clarity. Before they speak, they already know the destination. Their sentences aren't searching for meaning, they're delivering it. This is why they sound confident, not because they're speaking without fear, but because they've already done the thinking before anyone hears the first word. Unfortunately, most people do the opposite. They begin talking, hoping clarity will somehow appear along the way. Instead, the opposite happens. Their thoughts become tangled, their sentences grow longer, their explanations become heavier. And the more they talk, the less people understand. Have you ever caught yourself saying, "That's not what I meant," or "Let me explain that differently," or perhaps "What I'm trying to say is"? Those phrases reveal something important. They usually aren't signs of poor vocabulary. They're signs that the thought itself wasn't completely formed. Imagine trying to build a house while you're still designing the blueprint. Every brick would end up in the wrong place. You would constantly stop, move things around, start over, and eventually lose confidence in the structure itself. Communication works the same way. Your words are simply the construction materials. Your thinking is the blueprint. If the blueprint is unclear, no amount of beautiful language can save the building. That's why intelligent people sometimes sound surprisingly confusing. Knowledge alone isn't enough. You may know dozens of facts, hundreds of ideas, years of experience. But if those ideas haven't been organized, they arrive in the listener's mind exactly as they exist in yours. Scattered, disconnected, incomplete. Clear thinking is what transforms information into understanding. Think about the last conversation that truly impressed you. Perhaps it was a TED Talk, a university professor, a mentor, or even a friend giving simple advice. What made them memorable? It probably wasn't complicated vocabulary. It wasn't endless detail. It was the feeling that every sentence naturally led to the next. Nothing felt random. Nothing felt forced. Everything had direction. That is what clarity sounds like, and people instinctively trust it. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that speaking quickly makes them sound intelligent. In reality, speed often hides uncertainty. When we're afraid of silence, we begin filling every empty second with more words. We explain before we've decided what really matters. We repeat ourselves because we're still trying to understand our own point. Ironically, the faster we speak, the harder people must work to follow us. And the harder they work, the sooner they stop listening. Great communicators understand something different. They know that slowing down is not a weakness. It's a strategy. Imagine holding a glass of muddy water. If you keep shaking it, the water never becomes clear. But leave it untouched for a moment. The dirt settles naturally. The water becomes transparent. Your thoughts behave exactly the same way. A busy mind creates cloudy communication. A calm mind creates clear communication. This is why the pause before speaking is so powerful. Many people fear that pausing makes them appear uncertain. The opposite is usually true. A brief pause tells everyone in the room something important. I'm thinking. I'm choosing my words. What I'm about to say matters. That tiny moment creates authority, because confidence isn't measured by how quickly you answer. It's measured by how intentionally you respond. The next time someone asks you a difficult question, don't race toward the answer. Pause. Take one quiet breath. Ask yourself, what is the single idea I want this person to remember? Not 5 ideas, not 10, just one. Because every strong message begins with one clear thought. Everything else is simply support. This discipline becomes especially important in professional life. Imagine sitting in a job interview. The interviewer asks, "Tell me about yourself." Many candidates begin listing every job they've ever had, every skill, every achievement, every certificate. Within 2 minutes, the interviewer has forgotten the beginning. Now imagine another candidate. They pause briefly, smile, then say, "There are 3 things that define the way I work." Immediately, the listener has a map. Their brain knows where the conversation is going. Structure begins with clarity, and clarity begins with thinking. The same principle applies in everyday life. Whether you're explaining an idea to your family, giving advice to a friend, leading a meeting, negotiating with a client, or simply telling a story over dinner, people aren't searching for more information. They're searching for direction. They want someone to organize the idea for them. That's what leaders do. Leadership is not always standing in front of a crowd. Sometimes, leadership is simply making complex things feel simple. Notice something about the people whose words stay with you. They rarely overwhelm you with information. Instead, they remove confusion. That's a completely different skill. It's the ability to separate what's essential from what's merely interesting. Because clarity is not about saying everything. It's about saying what matters most. There is another obstacle that quietly destroys clear thinking: emotion, fear, frustration, the desire to impress, the need to prove yourself. These emotions create noise inside the mind, and noisy minds produce noisy communication. This doesn't mean emotions are bad. It means emotions should never drive your message. Imagine trying to drive through thick fog. You don't press the accelerator harder. You slow down. You become more deliberate. You pay closer attention. The same principle applies to communication. When emotions rise, your responsibility is not to speak faster. It's to think more carefully. Ask yourself 3 simple questions before responding. What am I truly trying to communicate? What is the simplest way to express it? And what does this person actually need to hear? Those 3 questions alone can transform almost every conversation you have, because they force your attention away from performance and back toward purpose. Clear thinkers don't try to sound intelligent. They try to make understanding effortless. And strangely enough, that is exactly what makes them sound intelligent. People trust those who reduce confusion. They respect those who provide direction. They remember those who simplify complexity. That is why clarity has always been one of the strongest forms of leadership. Not because it attracts attention, but because it removes uncertainty. So before you focus on improving your vocabulary, before you worry about sounding more confident, before you search for better techniques, learn to sit quietly with your own thoughts. Organize them, challenge them, simplify them. Because every powerful sentence begins long before it's spoken. It begins in the silence where clear thinking is born. And once your mind becomes clear, your voice naturally follows. Chapter 2. Speak with calm authority. The emergency room was unusually quiet that afternoon. Doctors moved quickly from one patient to another. Nurses hurried through the hallways. Monitors beeped relentlessly. Family members waited with anxious faces. In the middle of the chaos, a young resident physician froze. A patient had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. People began speaking over one another. Different suggestions came from every direction. Someone raised their voice. Another interrupted. The room grew louder by the second. Then, the senior physician walked in. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He didn't demand silence. He simply took one slow breath, looked around the room, and said calmly, "Everyone stop for 5 seconds." The room became still. He glanced at the monitor, checked the patient's chart, then spoke again. "We'll stabilize the airway first, then medication. After that, imaging. No long speech. No dramatic performance. Just 3 calm sentences." Within moments, everyone had a role. The panic disappeared. The patient received treatment. Later that evening, the resident asked him, "How did you stay so calm?" The older physician smiled. "I wasn't calmer than everyone else. I simply refused to let my emotions speak before my judgment." That answer reveals one of the greatest secrets of powerful communication. Authority rarely sounds loud, it sounds calm. Most people have been taught the opposite. They believe authority comes from volume, from speaking faster, from sounding energetic, from dominating every conversation. But if you've ever watched exceptional leaders, you know something feels different about them. They rarely rush. They rarely interrupt. They rarely compete for attention. And yet, everyone listens. Why? Because authority isn't created by intensity. It's created by stability. Think about the last time someone spoke to you with obvious anxiety. Their words may have been correct. Their ideas may even have been brilliant. But something inside you struggled to trust them completely. Perhaps their voice trembled. Perhaps they spoke too quickly. Perhaps they kept correcting themselves. Without realizing it, you weren't evaluating their knowledge. You were responding to their emotional state. Human beings do this instinctively. Long before we judge someone's words, we judge their presence. A calm presence tells us this person is in control. A frantic presence tells us something isn't stable. And when people sense instability, trust begins to disappear. This is why your voice communicates far more than information. It communicates your nervous system. Before listeners decide whether they believe your message, they unconsciously ask another question. Does this person believe themselves? Your tone often answers before your words ever can. Imagine 2 managers announcing the same company change. The first rushes into the meeting, speaking rapidly, breathing heavily, looking from one employee to another. "I'm sure everything will be okay. I think we'll figure it out." Nothing he says is necessarily wrong, but uncertainty fills every sentence. Now imagine another manager. She enters slowly, waits until everyone is seated, looks around the room, then says, "Here's what has changed. Here's what stays the same. And here's what we'll do next." The information may be almost identical, yet the emotional impact is completely different. One voice spreads anxiety, the other spreads confidence. That difference has very little to do with personality. It has everything to do with emotional regulation. Calm authority is not something people are born with. It's something they practice. The foundation of that practice begins with something so ordinary. Most people overlook it. Breathing. When you're nervous, notice what happens. Your breathing becomes shallow. Your shoulders tighten. Your throat stiffens. Your heartbeat accelerates. Without realizing it, your entire body prepares for danger, and your voice reflects every one of those physical changes. The pitch becomes higher. The pace becomes faster. The pauses disappear. Words begin crashing into one another. You may still have an excellent idea, but now your delivery is competing against your biology. Great communicators understand this. They don't try to control their voice directly. They control the body that produces the voice. Before important conversations, they breathe more slowly, not dramatically, just deliberately. One deeper breath, then another. Within seconds, their nervous system begins sending a different message. There is no emergency. As the body calms, the voice naturally follows. Notice how the most respected speakers rarely sound rushed. Even when discussing difficult topics, they maintain rhythm, not because they speak slowly for the sake of speaking slowly, but because they're thinking clearly enough to allow each sentence its own space. That rhythm gives listeners confidence. It tells them this person isn't reacting, they're choosing. And choice is one of the strongest signals of authority. There is another habit that quietly destroys calm authority: trying to prove yourself. The moment your goal becomes, I need everyone to see that I'm smart, everything changes. You begin adding unnecessary details, using complicated language, talking longer than necessary, explaining ideas that nobody questioned. The strange irony is this: the harder you try to sound intelligent, the less confident you often appear. Real authority doesn't need constant evidence. It allows the work to speak for itself. Imagine a mountain. It doesn't announce its height. It doesn't convince anyone of its strength. It simply stands there. And because it stands without effort, everyone recognizes its presence. Your communication should feel the same: steady, grounded, unshaken. This doesn't mean becoming emotionless. Some people misunderstand calmness as coldness. They're not the same. Calm communicators still smile, still laugh, still show empathy, still express passion, but they remain emotionally anchored. Their emotions serve the message. The message never serves the emotions. This becomes especially important during disagreement. Anyone can sound confident when everyone agrees. Real authority appears when someone challenges you. Imagine a colleague saying, I don't think that's the right approach. Most people immediately react. They interrupt, defend themselves, speak faster, raise their voice slightly without noticing. The conversation becomes a competition. But watch someone with genuine authority. They pause, not because they don't have an answer, because they refuse to answer emotionally. That pause creates something remarkable: space. Space to think, space to choose, space to respond instead of react. Then they speak calmly. Tell me more. What concerns you most? Suddenly, the conversation changes. Instead of protecting their ego, they're seeking understanding. Ironically, that makes them appear even stronger, because secure people don't fear questions. Only insecure people do. Another powerful habit of calm communicators is that they allow silence to exist. Many people rush because silence feels uncomfortable. They worry that if they stop talking, people will think they've forgotten their point. But silence often has the opposite effect. It gives your previous sentence time to breathe. Imagine reading a book with no punctuation, no periods, no commas, no paragraphs. Every idea would blend into the next. Your voice works exactly the same way. Pauses are punctuation for spoken language. Without them, even brilliant ideas become exhausting. With them, ordinary ideas become memorable. This is why experienced speakers rarely fear quiet moments. They understand that silence is not empty. Silence is where meaning settles. Think about the leaders you admire most. Whether they're running companies, teaching students, coaching athletes, or leading nations, they all share one characteristic: they never appear rushed by their own emotions. They create emotional stability before asking others to follow them. Because leadership begins inside before it ever becomes visible outside. Here's another truth worth remembering. People rarely remember every sentence you spoke, but they almost always remember how you made them feel. Did your presence calm the room or increase the tension? Did people leave your conversation feeling more certain or more confused? That emotional memory lasts far longer than individual words, which means your greatest communication tool isn't your vocabulary, it's your emotional state. Every conversation gives you a choice. You can enter the room carrying urgency, or you can enter carrying steadiness. You can react to pressure, or you can become the person who absorbs it. You can speak from fear, or you can speak from intention. That choice becomes audible every single time you open your mouth. So the next time your heart begins racing before an important conversation, don't tell yourself to sound more confident. Don't force your voice lower. Don't try to imitate someone else. Instead, take one slow breath. Relax your shoulders. Allow yourself one brief pause and remind yourself of something simple. Authority isn't about controlling other people, it's about controlling yourself. Because the moment you master your own emotional state, your voice begins carrying a kind of confidence that no amount of volume could ever replace. Chapter 3. Use words that carry weight. The courtroom was completely silent. 12 jurors sat only a few feet away. On one side, a young attorney shuffled through a stack of papers. This was his first major trial. He had spent months researching every detail, every law, every witness, every possible argument. When the judge nodded, he stood confidently, or at least he tried to. Ladies and gentlemen, I just kind of think, maybe, it seems like, I believe there's a possibility. Sentence after sentence, his words became softer, longer, less certain. Although the evidence strongly supported his case, his language quietly weakened it. An hour later, the senior attorney for the opposing side stood. He carried only a thin notebook. He looked at the jury, waited for a moment, then said, "Let's begin with one fact." Not 10 facts, one. He continued, "The evidence tells one story. The timeline confirms it. The documents prove it. No dramatic performance, no complicated vocabulary, no endless explanations. Every sentence felt clean, purposeful, deliberate." When the verdict was announced, the young attorney didn't lose because he lacked knowledge. He lost because his own words made him sound as though he didn't fully believe them. That day, he learned something every influential communicator eventually discovers. People don't only evaluate your ideas, they evaluate your certainty. And certainty is often hidden inside the smallest words you choose. Words are never just words. Every sentence carries emotional weight. Every phrase quietly tells people something about you. Sometimes it tells them you're confident, sometimes it tells them you're unsure, and most of the time, you don't even realize you're sending those signals. Think about how often people say things like, "I guess," "maybe," "sort of," "kind of," "I think," "probably." These expressions seem harmless. In casual conversation, they often are. But when they appear in every important sentence, they slowly drain the power from your message. Imagine someone standing in front of a team and saying, "I think we should probably consider changing our strategy." Now compare it with, "We need to change our strategy." The idea hasn't changed. The information hasn't changed. Only the language has. Yet the emotional impact is completely different. One sentence sounds like a suggestion. The other sounds like leadership. People don't simply hear vocabulary. They hear conviction. This doesn't mean every statement should sound absolute. Strong communicators don't pretend to know everything. In fact, they are often the first to admit when they don't know something. But when they do know, their language reflects it. They don't hide certainty behind unnecessary hesitation. One of the biggest communication mistakes people make is confusing politeness with uncertainty. You can be respectful without sounding doubtful. You can be humble without weakening every sentence. Confidence and kindness are not opposites. They often work best together. Imagine a manager giving feedback. One says, "I was kind of wondering if maybe you could improve this section." Another says, "This section needs improvement, and here's how we can strengthen it." Both are respectful. Only one is clear. And clarity almost always creates more trust than excessive softness. Because people crave direction, not confusion. Your vocabulary shapes more than conversations. It gradually shapes your identity. Think about that for a moment. If you repeatedly tell yourself, "I'll try," your mind begins expecting failure. If you constantly say, "maybe someday," your future remains permanently postponed. But when your language changes, something inside you changes too. Instead of saying, "I'll try to become a better speaker," imagine saying, "I will practice speaking every day." One describes a wish, the other describes a commitment. Language influences belief. Belief influences behavior. Behavior eventually becomes identity. This is why powerful communicators pay attention to small words, because small words often create big outcomes. Imagine your vocabulary as a toolbox. Some tools are dull. They require enormous effort just to make a small impact. Other tools are sharp. One precise movement accomplishes what dozens of weak movements cannot. Words work exactly the same way. A sharp sentence often accomplishes more than a 5-minute explanation. People remember concise statements, rarely endless speeches. Consider history. The speeches that changed nations, inspired movements, or transformed companies were rarely remembered because they were the longest. They're remembered because they contained unforgettable sentences. Simple, direct, clear. That's the goal. Not more words, better words. Another habit that weakens communication is over-explaining. Have you ever noticed yourself answering a simple question, then continuing to talk, even after the listener already understood? Many people do this, not because they have more to say, but because silence feels uncomfortable, or because they're seeking reassurance. Ironically, the extra explanation often creates doubt where none previously existed. Imagine asking someone, "Can you finish this project by Friday?" Instead of answering, "Yes," they respond, "Yeah, I think so, unless something unexpected happens, because last week was really busy, but I'll definitely do my best." Which answer inspires more confidence? The shortest one. Not because it's shorter, because it's cleaner. Great communicators understand that every unnecessary sentence competes with the important one. If everything is emphasized, nothing is emphasized. This is why editing your language is just as important as expanding it. Professional writers revise. Professional musicians rehearse. Professional athletes refine their movements. Professional communicators refine their words. Not because they lack ideas, because they respect the listener's attention. Attention is one of the most valuable things another person can give you. Treat it carefully. Every extra sentence costs attention. Every unclear phrase spends trust. Every unnecessary filler weakens momentum. On the other hand, every precise sentence builds credibility. Every direct statement creates confidence. Every intentional word increases influence. There is another important principle. Strong language is not aggressive language. Some people misunderstand confidence. They think sounding powerful means sounding forceful, interrupting, dominating, speaking over people. That isn't strength. That's insecurity disguised as confidence. Real strength doesn't need to overpower. It simply needs to be understood. Think about the people whose advice you value most. Perhaps a mentor, a respected colleague, a parent, or a teacher who changed your life. Chances are, they didn't constantly raise their voice. They didn't overwhelm you with complicated vocabulary. They simply spoke with remarkable clarity. Every sentence felt intentional. Every word earned its place. That's the kind of communicator people remember, because precision creates trust, and trust creates influence. One practical habit can immediately improve your communication. Before speaking, ask yourself, if I could only use one sentence, what would I say? That question forces your mind to search for the core idea. Once you've found it, everything else becomes easier. Support the sentence. Don't bury it. Lead with clarity, not complexity. Remember, people rarely admire someone because they used impressive words. They admire someone because they made difficult ideas feel simple. That's a completely different skill, and it's one worth practicing every single day. The next time you speak, listen carefully to your own language. Notice how often you soften your message without realizing it. Notice how often you apologize for ideas that don't require an apology. Notice how often uncertainty appears where confidence should exist. Then make one small change. Replace one weak phrase with one clear statement, not to sound more important, not to dominate the conversation, but to let your words reflect the confidence that's already growing inside you. Because influence doesn't begin with louder voices. It begins with stronger language. And every powerful communicator is built one deliberate word at a time. Chapter 4. Structure your message like a leader. The room was filled with experienced professionals, department heads, project managers, executives. Everyone had gathered to solve a problem that had already cost the company millions. After a few minutes, the CEO looked toward a young manager sitting near the end of the table. "You've been studying this issue for months." What do you think? The young manager immediately began speaking. Well, before I answer that, I think it's important to understand what happened last year, because if we look back at the previous reports and then compare them with 5 minutes passed, he shared statistics, background information, historical details, several interesting observations. Everything he said was true. Everything he said was relevant. Yet something was missing. No one in the room knew what he actually wanted them to do. When he finally finished, the room remained silent. Then the CEO nodded politely. "Thank you." He turned to another executive. "What would you recommend?" The older executive stood. He didn't begin with history. He didn't begin with explanations. He simply said, "We have one problem. Our customers no longer trust the delivery schedule. We fix that first." Silence. Then he continued. "There are 3 reasons this happened." He explained each one briefly. Finally, he closed with, "Here's my recommendation. We rebuild the scheduling system within 60 days. I'll explain how." Less than 4 minutes later, the meeting was over. A decision had been made. As everyone left the room, the young manager couldn't understand what had happened. He had spoken almost twice as long. He had presented more information. Yet somehow, the older executive had influenced the room far more than he had. The difference wasn't intelligence. The difference wasn't experience. The difference was structure. Many people assume communication is about having good ideas, but ideas alone are rarely enough. Without structure, even brilliant ideas become difficult to follow. Imagine giving someone 1,000 puzzle pieces without showing them the picture on the box. Every piece may be correct, every piece may belong, but without direction, the listener spends all their energy trying to understand where everything fits. Eventually, they stop trying. Communication works exactly the same way. People don't only need information, they need a path. They need to know where the conversation is going before they can enjoy the journey. This is why great communicators rarely sound complicated, not because their ideas are simple, but because their thinking is organized. They never force the audience to build the structure themselves. They build it first, then invite everyone else to walk through it. Think about the last presentation that completely lost your attention. It probably didn't happen because the topic was boring. It happened because the speaker wandered. They started with one point, then jumped to another, returned to the first, added an unrelated story, introduced a new idea, then circled back again. By the end, everyone remembered fragments. Nobody remembered the message. That's what happens when information has no backbone. A message without structure is like trying to travel through an unfamiliar city without a map. You keep moving, but you're never quite sure where you're going. Great leaders never make people feel lost. They create certainty from the very beginning. One of the simplest habits separates influential communicators from ordinary ones. Before they begin speaking, they ask themselves one question. What is the destination? Not what do I know? Not what should I mention? But where do I want this conversation to end? That single question changes everything. Because once you know the destination, every sentence suddenly has a purpose. Every example supports one idea. Every story serves one direction. Nothing exists by accident. Think of communication like building a bridge. The first step is giving people a solid place to stand. That's your main point. Without it, everything else feels unstable. Unfortunately, most people begin with details. They spend several minutes creating context, sharing history, adding background, explaining circumstances. Only then do they reveal the actual point. By that time, many listeners have already become mentally exhausted. Strong communicators reverse the process. They begin with clarity, then they provide support. Imagine walking into a meeting and saying, "Our biggest challenge isn't sales, it's customer retention." Immediately, everyone understands the subject. Now, every statistic, every example, every explanation has a place to belong. The listener isn't guessing anymore, they're following. That feeling of guidance creates trust, because human beings naturally relax when they know where they're going. After establishing the main point, great communicators support it. But here's another mistake people often make. They believe more evidence always creates more persuasion. It doesn't. Too much information often weakens the message. Imagine trying to convince a friend to watch your favorite movie. You don't explain every scene, every character, every line of dialogue. You give them just enough, a compelling premise, one memorable moment, a reason to care. Then you stop. Curiosity finishes the work. Communication should feel the same. Give enough information to strengthen the idea, not so much that the idea disappears beneath it. There's another element that quietly strengthens every message: the pause. Many people rush from one thought directly into the next, afraid that silence will break the momentum. In reality, silence often creates momentum. Imagine listening to music where every note is played without rhythm. No rests, no spacing, just continuous sound. Eventually, it becomes noise. Words behave exactly the same way. Pauses create shape. They allow important ideas to settle. They tell the listener, this matters. This is worth remembering. Without pauses, every sentence competes for attention. With pauses, the important ones stand out naturally. Then comes the final piece: direction. One of the biggest reasons conversations accomplish nothing is because they end without purpose. People understand the discussion. They even agree with it. Then everyone leaves. Nothing changes. Great communicators rarely allow that to happen. They don't finish with, "So that's basically it." Instead, they answer one final question: what happens next? Every meaningful conversation should move someone forward, perhaps toward a decision, perhaps toward action, perhaps toward deeper understanding, but always toward something. Because communication without direction is movement without destination. Imagine a coach giving a halftime speech. If the coach simply explains what went wrong, the team leaves informed, but not transformed. Now imagine the coach ending with, "In the second half, we pressure higher, we pass faster, we trust each other." Suddenly, everyone knows exactly what to do. Direction creates momentum. Momentum creates confidence. Confidence creates action. This is why leadership is impossible without structure. Leaders don't simply share thoughts. They organize them. They simplify them. Then they guide others through them. There's another benefit most people overlook. Structure doesn't only help the listener. It helps the speaker. When you know exactly where you're going, you stop worrying about what to say next. Your mind becomes quieter. Your pace becomes steadier. Your confidence grows naturally. Not because you've memorized every sentence, but because you understand the path. Think about a skilled tour guide. They don't panic halfway through the tour wondering where to go next. They already know the route. That certainty allows them to enjoy the journey. Your communication should feel exactly the same. When your ideas have structure, your attention becomes available for something much more important: connecting with people, listening, observing, adjusting. Instead of desperately searching for your next sentence, so before your next presentation, before your next difficult conversation, before your next meeting, don't ask yourself, what should I say first? Ask yourself, what do I want people to remember when I finish? Build everything around that answer. Because every unforgettable message, every inspiring speech, every influential leader shares one invisible characteristic: their words never wander. They always know exactly where they're going. And because they know, everyone else is willing to follow. Chapter 5: Speak to Make People Act. The meeting ended exactly as everyone expected. People nodded politely. A few smiled. Someone even said, "That was a great presentation." The presenter packed away his laptop feeling proud. He had explained the strategy clearly. The numbers made sense. The charts looked impressive. Every question had been answered. As employees walked out of the room, he overheard two colleagues talking. "So, what are we supposed to do now?" "I'm not really sure. Maybe we'll hear more next week." Nothing happened. No one changed their behavior. No one started the project. No one took ownership. A month later, the same problem still existed. The presentation had been informative, but it hadn't been influential. A few weeks after that, the company's operations director held another meeting. This time, he spoke for less than 15 minutes. He explained the situation. Then he paused, looked around the room, and said, "Before you leave today, every department manager will submit one action they can complete by Friday. Next Monday, we'll review the results together." That was it. No dramatic ending, no motivational speech, just one clear next step. By the following week, the project had already begun moving forward. The difference wasn't intelligence, it wasn't preparation, it wasn't even communication. It was direction. Because information may change what people know, but direction changes what people do. Many people believe the purpose of communication is to help others understand. Understanding certainly matters, but understanding alone is never the finish line. Imagine reading an inspiring book about health. You finish the final page, convinced that exercise is important, healthy eating matters, sleep affects everything. You agree with every chapter. Then, the next morning, you wake up and do exactly what you've always done. Did the book fail? Not necessarily. It informed you. But information alone rarely changes behavior. Communication follows the same principle. People don't remember speakers because they explain something beautifully. They remember speakers who move them to act. That is the real difference between explaining and influencing. A communicator transfers knowledge. An influencer creates movement. One fills the mind, the other changes behavior. This is why some conversations feel powerful, even when they contain very few words. Think about a great coach before an important game. The players already know the rules. They've practiced for months. The coach isn't there to teach them football. The coach is there to unlock action. He reminds them of one priority, one adjustment, one decision, then sends them onto the field ready to move. That's influence. Great communicators understand something many people overlook. Every conversation should quietly answer one question. What do I want this person to do after we're finished? Not what do I want them to think, not what do I want them to admire, but what action should naturally come next? Without that answer, communication often becomes entertainment. Interesting, but forgettable. Imagine you're leading a team meeting. You spend 20 minutes explaining why customer service matters. You show research, examples, statistics. Everyone agrees. Then the meeting ends. Nothing changes. Now imagine ending differently. Before you leave this room, I want each of you to call one customer you've helped this month. Ask them one question. What could we have done better? Immediately, the conversation has direction. People know exactly what comes next. Clarity creates movement, and movement creates results. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that motivation creates action. Often, it's the opposite. Action creates motivation. Think about how difficult it can feel to begin exercising, cleaning your home, starting a business, writing a book. The hardest part is rarely the work itself, it's beginning. That's why influential communicators make the first step feel small. Instead of saying, completely transform your life, they say, start with 5 minutes. Instead of build an incredible business, they say, find your first customer. Instead of become a confident speaker, they say, speak up once during tomorrow's meeting. Small actions remove resistance. Once movement begins, momentum usually follows. This principle appears everywhere. A skilled teacher doesn't overwhelm students with everything they need to learn. A good teacher gives them the next lesson. A great leader doesn't solve every future problem today. They solve today's problem, then tomorrow's. Direction always feels manageable. Confusion always feels overwhelming. Another reason people fail to inspire action is because they hide the destination beneath endless explanation. Imagine asking someone for directions. Instead of saying, turn left at the next intersection, they begin telling you the history of the neighborhood, the architecture, the weather, the restaurants nearby. Interesting? Perhaps. Helpful? Not really. Yet many communicators do exactly this. They bury the next step beneath unnecessary detail. Strong communicators do the opposite. They place the destination where everyone can see it. then everything else supports that destination. This is especially important when leading people, employees, children, students, clients, friends. They all experience uncertainty, and uncertainty creates hesitation. Sometimes people aren't waiting for more information. They're waiting for permission. Permission to begin. Permission to decide. Permission to move. A confident communicator quietly provides that permission, not by controlling others, but by reducing uncertainty. Think back to a moment when someone changed your life with just one sentence. Perhaps a teacher said, apply for the scholarship. A mentor said, start now. A friend said, call them. A parent said, you can handle this. Simple words, clear direction, life-changing results. Notice something interesting. None of those sentences were complicated. Influence rarely sounds complicated. It sounds decisive. There is another lesson hidden here. People don't naturally resist action. They resist unclear action. Imagine asking your team, let's improve communication. What does that actually mean? Everyone will interpret it differently. Now imagine saying, beginning tomorrow, we'll spend the first 5 minutes of every meeting identifying our top priority. Now the action is visible, specific, achievable. Leadership lives inside specificity. Vague language creates vague behavior. Specific language creates consistent behavior. That is why powerful communicators almost always finish with direction. Not because they're controlling, because they're responsible. They understand something most people forget. Every conversation leaves people standing at a crossroads. If you don't help them choose a direction, most will simply stay where they are. This is why endings matter so much. People often remember the final sentence long after they've forgotten the first. The final sentence becomes the emotional takeaway, the instruction, the invitation, the challenge. So don't waste it. Instead of ending with, so that's basically everything, end with purpose. This is our next step. Here's what matters now. Start today. Make the call. Ask the question. Take the first step. Simple, direct, action-oriented. And remember, people are rarely transformed by what they hear once. They're transformed by what they repeatedly choose to do. Your words cannot force those choices, but they can make the first step feel possible. That is one of the greatest gifts any communicator can offer. Not endless inspiration, not endless information, but a clear path forward. Because when people know exactly where to begin, they're far more likely to begin at all. And that's the moment communication becomes influence. Not when people leave impressed, but when they leave ready to act. Chapter 6, Master Your Emotional Tone. The customer wasn't angry when he walked into the store. He was disappointed. His order had arrived 3 days late. The product wasn't damaged. Nothing had been broken. He simply wanted an explanation. A young employee greeted him with a nervous smile. I'm sorry, but that's not really our fault. The shipping company was responsible. We actually did everything correctly. Everything the employee said was technically true. Every fact was accurate. Yet with every sentence, the customer's frustration grew. His voice became louder. His posture stiffened. Within minutes, a simple conversation had become an argument. Hearing the raised voices, the store manager stepped over. She listened quietly for less than 30 seconds. Then she turned toward the customer. I can understand why you're frustrated. If I were expecting an important delivery, I'd feel the same way. She paused. Whether the mistake happened here or somewhere else, you've still had a bad experience, and that's something we want to make right. The customer's shoulders relaxed almost immediately. Nothing had changed. The package was still late. The facts were exactly the same. The only thing that changed was the emotional tone. That afternoon, the young employee asked the manager, "How did you calm him down so quickly?" She smiled. I wasn't trying to win the conversation. I was trying to understand the emotion behind it. That simple distinction separates ordinary communicators from extraordinary ones. Because people rarely respond to words alone. They respond to the feelings carried inside those words. Most people spend years improving what they say. Very few spend time improving how they say it. Yet emotional tone often determines whether your message is accepted or rejected. Imagine hearing these three sentences. I understand. I understand. I understand. The words are identical, but depending on the tone, the meaning changes completely. One version sounds caring, another sounds impatient, a third sounds sarcastic. The vocabulary never changed, only the emotion did. This is why communication is far more than language. Every conversation contains two messages: the message carried by your words and the message carried by your emotional energy. People usually believe the second one. Human beings are remarkably sensitive to emotional signals. Long before children understand complicated language, they recognize warmth, frustration, kindness, fear, approval, disappointment. We continue using those instincts throughout adulthood without realizing it. We constantly ask ourselves, how does this person feel while speaking to me? That answer shapes everything. You may deliver perfect advice, but if your tone feels dismissive, people stop listening. You may give constructive feedback, but if your tone carries contempt, people become defensive. You may even offer sincere praise, but if your voice lacks warmth, the compliment feels empty. Your emotional tone becomes the invisible frame around every sentence, and frames change the way pictures are seen. One of the most common mistakes people make is believing that emotion weakens communication. In reality, uncontrolled emotion weakens communication. Intentional emotion strengthens it. Think about the greatest teachers you've ever had. They didn't simply transfer information. They made you feel curious, safe, inspired, capable. Their lessons stayed with you because emotion helped memory. Now think about someone who constantly sounded irritated. Even when offering good advice, listening felt exhausting. Eventually, you probably stopped asking for their opinion altogether, not because they lacked wisdom, because the emotional cost of listening became too high. Every conversation creates an emotional experience. The question is, are you creating the experience intentionally or accidentally? Another habit that weakens emotional tone is speaking while your emotions are still controlling you. Imagine receiving a harsh email. Your heart beats faster. Your face becomes warm. Without thinking, you immediately begin writing a response. Every sentence feels justified. Every argument feels necessary. An hour later, you read the email again. Suddenly, half of what you wrote feels unnecessary. What changed? Not the facts, your emotional state. Strong communicators recognize this pattern. They understand that emotions are valuable sources of information. But poor decision makers, feelings should inform your communication. They should never control it. Imagine driving a car. The dashboard warns you that fuel is running low. That's useful information. But imagine letting the fuel gauge grab the steering wheel. That would be absurd. Emotions are the same. Notice them, respect them, but don't hand them control. This becomes especially important during conflict. Many people enter difficult conversations with one goal: to prove they're right. Unfortunately, that goal usually guarantees resistance, because the moment people feel attacked, their minds stop exploring. They begin defending. Real influence begins somewhere else, with understanding, not agreement. Understanding. Those two ideas are very different. You can understand someone's fear without agreeing with their conclusion. You can understand someone's frustration without accepting hurtful behavior. You can understand someone's perspective without abandoning your own. People don't need you to surrender your beliefs. They simply need to feel that you've heard theirs. That feeling alone lowers emotional tension. Imagine saying, "You're overreacting." Now compare it with, "I can see why this feels important to you." The second sentence doesn't admit fault. It doesn't promise agreement. It simply acknowledges emotion. And acknowledgement often opens doors that logic cannot. Another powerful principle is emotional matching, not emotional imitation. Matching. Suppose someone comes to you excited about a new opportunity. You respond in a cold, monotone voice. What are the numbers? Technically, that's a reasonable question. Emotionally, it feels disconnected. Now imagine matching their enthusiasm first. That's exciting. Tell me what happened. Only then do you ask practical questions. Now they feel understood. The same principle works in sadness, stress, celebration, disappointment. People connect more easily with those who recognize their emotional reality before trying to change it. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally overwhelmed by everyone around you. Quite the opposite. It means remaining emotionally stable while demonstrating emotional awareness. That's a subtle but important difference. Great communicators don't absorb every emotion they encounter. They acknowledge it without being controlled by it. Think about a skilled therapist, a trusted physician, an experienced firefighter, or an airline captain speaking during turbulence. If they panic, everyone else panics. Their calmness becomes contagious. Emotional stability spreads, so does emotional instability. Which one are you spreading? There is another lesson worth remembering. Your emotional tone toward yourself matters just as much as your tone toward others. Listen to the conversations happening inside your own mind. Do you constantly say, "I'm terrible at this. I always mess things up. I'll probably fail"? Those sentences may never be spoken aloud, yet they shape every conversation you have. Because eventually, your inner voice becomes your outer voice. People who constantly criticize themselves often sound hesitant. People who regularly encourage themselves often sound grounded. Your relationship with yourself quietly becomes part of your communication style. That's why confidence isn't simply something you perform. It's something you practice internally long before anyone hears your voice. Every interaction gives you an opportunity to choose your emotional tone. You can answer impatience with more impatience, or with calmness. You can answer criticism with defensiveness, or curiosity. You can answer frustration with frustration, or understanding. None of those choices change the past, but they dramatically influence what happens next. People often believe the strongest communicator is the one who wins every argument. In reality, the strongest communicator is often the one who prevents unnecessary arguments from happening in the first place, not by avoiding difficult conversations, but by managing the emotional atmosphere inside them. Because conversations are like fires, a careless tone adds fuel, a thoughtful tone removes oxygen. The words matter, but the emotional climate matters just as much. So before your next important conversation, ask yourself one question. What emotion do I want this person to leave with? Not just, what do I want them to remember? But how do I want them to feel? Respected, hopeful, understood, confident, safe enough to tell the truth? Choose that emotion first, then allow your words to support it, because people may forget the exact sentences you used. They may forget your examples. They may even forget your conclusions. But they will remember how they felt when they were with you. And that feeling, more than any perfectly crafted sentence, will determine whether your message truly lasts. Chapter 7. Build trust before you try to persuade. On his first day as the new sales director, Daniel was eager to prove himself. The company had hired him because of his impressive track record. He had increased revenue everywhere he had worked. He understood negotiation. He understood marketing. And he believed he understood people. His first meeting with the sales team lasted almost an hour. He spoke with confidence. He explained his vision. He introduced ambitious targets. He described new strategies that, in his words, would completely transform the business. When the meeting ended, everyone applauded politely, but as employees walked back to their desks, almost nobody believed him. Not because his ideas were bad, not because the strategy wouldn't work, but because they didn't know him. To them, he was simply another executive making promises. Over the following weeks, Daniel noticed something strange. People nodded during meetings, yet deadlines were missed. Suggestions weren't implemented. Conversations felt unusually cautious. One afternoon, an older employee invited him to lunch. After a few minutes, she smiled and said, "Can I tell you something honestly?" Daniel nodded. "You've spent weeks trying to convince us, but you've hardly spent any time getting to know us." He looked surprised. She continued, "We don't follow ideas. We follow people we trust. That sentence stayed with him for years because he realized something many communicators never discover. Persuasion doesn't begin with convincing, it begins with trust. Most people believe influence is built through stronger arguments, better evidence, more impressive presentations, sharper logic. Those things certainly matter, but they rarely come first. Before people evaluate your ideas, they quietly evaluate you. Can I trust this person? Do they genuinely care? Will they keep their word? Do they understand me? These questions are rarely spoken aloud, yet they shape nearly every important conversation you'll ever have. Think about your own life. Has someone ever given you advice that you immediately accepted? Not because the advice was extraordinary, but because you deeply respected the person giving it? Now think about another moment. Someone offered excellent advice. Objectively speaking, it was probably correct. Yet you ignored it. Why? Because something inside you resisted the messenger. The advice didn't fail. Trust did. Human beings are emotional decision makers long before they become logical ones. Logic helps justify our decisions. Trust often determines whether we even consider them. Imagine walking across a bridge. You don't inspect every bolt, every beam, every cable. You cross because you trust the structure. Communication works in much the same way. People don't analyze every sentence equally. When trust exists, small mistakes are forgiven. When trust is absent, even perfect explanations create suspicion. This is why relationships matter so much. Influence grows slowly, conversation by conversation, promise by promise, action by action. One of the fastest ways to lose trust is saying things you don't truly believe. People are remarkably skilled at detecting insincerity, perhaps not consciously, but emotionally. Imagine someone saying, "I'm happy to help," while avoiding eye contact, checking their watch, sounding impatient. The words express generosity. The behavior communicates something entirely different. Most people believe the behavior because authenticity cannot be faked for very long. Real trust requires consistency. Your words, your actions, and your intentions must point in the same direction. When they do, people relax. They stop wondering what you're really trying to achieve. They begin listening instead. Another common mistake is trying to appear perfect. Many people assume credibility comes from never admitting mistakes. In reality, the opposite is often true. Imagine two leaders. The first says, "Everything is under control," even when everyone knows it isn't. The second says, "We made a mistake. Here's what we've learned, and here's how we'll fix it." Which leader feels more trustworthy? Usually the second, because honesty creates credibility. Perfection often creates distance. People don't expect flawless human beings. They expect truthful ones. This is why admitting uncertainty, when appropriate, can actually strengthen your influence. Saying, "I don't know," followed by, "but I'll find out," often creates far more confidence than pretending to know an answer you don't actually have. Trust grows whenever honesty defeats ego. Another powerful principle is listening before persuading. Many people enter conversations already preparing their next response. They hear only enough to begin speaking again. But influential communicators behave differently. They become curious, not because curiosity is polite, because curiosity builds connection. Imagine meeting someone who asks thoughtful questions, listens without interrupting, remembers details from previous conversations, allows you to finish your thoughts. How do you feel around that person? Most likely, respected, and respect becomes fertile ground for trust. Listening communicates something words alone cannot. It says, "You matter. I value your perspective. I'm not just waiting for my turn to speak." Ironically, the more people feel heard, the more willing they become to hear you. This is why persuasion often begins in silence, not in speaking, but in listening deeply enough to understand what truly matters to the other person. Trust also grows through reliability. Imagine a friend who constantly says, "I'll call you tomorrow," but never does. Eventually, you stop believing the promise. Now imagine another friend who says little, but always follows through. Whose opinion carries more weight? Almost always the second. Because trust isn't built by dramatic moments, it's built by repeated consistency. Small actions, repeated over time, every promise kept, every commitment honored, every conversation handled with integrity. These ordinary moments become the foundation of extraordinary influence. Another habit worth developing is giving credit generously. Insecure communicators often need recognition. They protect ideas, seek applause, compete for attention. Secure communicators do something different. They celebrate others. They acknowledge contributions. They share success. Strangely enough, the more credit they give away, the more respect they receive. Because people naturally trust those who aren't constantly trying to elevate themselves. Humility creates safety, and people trust those who make them feel safe. Think about the best mentor you've ever known. Did they constantly remind you of their achievements? Probably not. They focused on your growth, not their reputation. That quiet confidence becomes unforgettable. There is another truth that many people overlook. Trust cannot be demanded, it cannot be rushed, and it certainly cannot be manipulated. The moment people feel manipulated, trust begins disappearing. Real influence never depends on pressure. It depends on credibility. Pressure may produce temporary compliance. Credibility creates lasting commitment. This distinction matters in every part of life. Whether you're leading a company, building a friendship, raising children, teaching students, or speaking to an audience, your ideas travel only as far as your credibility allows. That is why character will always outperform charisma in the long run. Charisma may capture attention. Character keeps it. Charisma may open the door. Character invites people to stay. So before your next important conversation, ask yourself a different question. Instead of asking, how can I convince this person? Ask, how can I become someone they naturally trust? The answer may not involve speaking more. It may involve listening more carefully, keeping one promise, admitting one mistake, showing one act of genuine respect. Because trust is rarely built through grand gestures. It grows quietly, in moments that seem almost too small to matter, until one day, people stop questioning your intentions. They stop wondering whether to believe you, and they begin following your words, not because you forced them, but because you've earned the right to be believed. That is the true foundation of lasting influence, and every meaningful conversation is built upon it. Chapter 8. Learn the power of silence. The negotiation had already lasted nearly 2 hours. Two companies sat across from each other. Millions of dollars depended on what happened next. Every proposal had been answered with another proposal. Every argument had been met with a counter-argument. The conversation had become a contest of words. Then, one executive made an offer. He slid the document across the table. No one spoke. The younger members of his team shifted uneasily in their seats. One whispered, "Shouldn't we explain why it's a good offer?" The executive gently raised his hand and waited. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Finally, the other company's CEO leaned forward. He studied the document again, then sighed. "If you can adjust this one condition, we have a deal." As everyone left the room later that afternoon, one of the younger negotiators couldn't hide his curiosity. "We won because of the silence, didn't we?" The executive smiled. "No, we won because we didn't rush to rescue the silence." That lesson would become one of the most valuable communication skills he ever learned. Because silence is not the absence of communication. Often, it is the most powerful part of it. Most people are afraid of silence. The moment a conversation becomes quiet, they feel pressure to fill the space. They explain more. They repeat themselves. They introduce new ideas that never needed to be introduced. Not because the conversation required it, but because the silence felt uncomfortable. Unfortunately, that habit often weakens the very message they were trying to strengthen. Imagine asking someone, "Will you marry me?" Then immediately continuing, "I mean, you don't have to answer now. I know it's a big decision. Maybe I shouldn't have asked like this." The additional words don't create confidence. They reveal anxiety. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can say is nothing at all. Silence gives your words room to breathe. Think about hearing a beautiful piece of music. If every note were played without pause, without rhythm, without moments of stillness, it would quickly become overwhelming. Music depends on silence just as much as sound. Conversation works exactly the same way. The pauses are not interruptions, they are part of the message. They allow important ideas to settle inside another person's mind. Without them, words simply collide. Many people believe quick responses demonstrate intelligence, but immediate answers often communicate something else. They suggest that the speaker is reacting rather than thinking. Great communicators rarely rush, not because they don't know what to say, because they care enough to choose the right words. Imagine asking an experienced judge a difficult question. Would you trust the judge more if the answer came instantly or after a thoughtful pause? Most people instinctively prefer the second. The pause communicates care, deliberation, responsibility. It quietly says, I'm taking this seriously. That creates credibility. Silence also has another remarkable ability. It invites other people to speak. One of the biggest communication mistakes is believing influence comes from speaking more. Often, influence comes from creating space. Imagine you're having lunch with a close friend. You ask, how have you really been lately? They hesitate. You immediately ask another question, then another, then begin sharing your own story. The opportunity disappears. Now imagine something different. You ask the same question, then remain silent. Your friend looks down, takes a deep breath, and finally says, honestly, I've been struggling. That answer didn't appear because of another question. It appeared because of the silence that followed the first one. People often reveal their deepest thoughts just after the moment most communicators would have interrupted. Silence communicates patience, and patience communicates respect. This principle becomes especially valuable in leadership. Many managers believe they must always provide answers, always solve problems, always direct every discussion. Exceptional leaders understand something different. Sometimes the most powerful question is followed by complete silence. What do you think? Then they wait. The silence encourages ownership. People begin thinking for themselves instead of looking upward for every solution. That is how confidence grows, not by constantly receiving answers, but by being trusted enough to discover them. Teachers understand this principle as well. Imagine a classroom. The teacher asks a difficult question. No hands go up immediately. An inexperienced teacher answers the question for the students. An experienced teacher waits. The room becomes quiet. Students begin thinking harder. Eventually, a hand slowly rises. The silence created learning. Had the teacher rushed to rescue the moment, that opportunity would have disappeared. Silence doesn't only help other people think, it helps you think too. Have you ever sent a message while feeling angry, only to regret it an hour later? Most people have. The problem wasn't the conversation. The problem was the absence of pause. One moment of silence could have prevented pages of unnecessary explanation. One deep breath could have changed the entire outcome. Emotion loves speed. Wisdom often prefers stillness. This is why silence becomes especially valuable during disagreement. Imagine someone criticizing your work. Your first instinct may be to defend yourself immediately, to explain, to justify, to prove them wrong. Instead, imagine listening completely, pausing, then asking, can you tell me more about what concerns you? Notice what changes. The conversation shifts. Instead of becoming a battle, it becomes an exploration. Silence creates curiosity. Curiosity creates understanding. Understanding creates solutions. Another overlooked benefit of silence is confidence. People often assume that talking continuously makes them appear knowledgeable. In reality, constant talking frequently suggests insecurity. It's as though the speaker fears that if they stop, their authority will disappear. Confident communicators don't fear quiet moments. They know their value isn't measured by the number of words they produce. It's measured by the quality of the words they choose. Think about someone who always interrupts, finishes your sentences, rushes into every conversation. How do you usually feel around them? Probably unheard. Now think about someone who truly listens, who allows silence, Who gives you time to finish? How do you feel with them? Valued, understood, safe. People are naturally drawn toward those feelings, which means silence can strengthen relationships in ways that speaking never could. There is another lesson hidden inside quiet moments. Not every statement requires an immediate response. Sometimes criticism deserves reflection before reaction. Sometimes praise deserves gratitude before explanation. Sometimes questions deserve thought before answers. The ability to pause is often the ability to choose, and choice is one of the clearest signs of emotional maturity. Every pause creates a small space between stimulus and response. Inside that space, you regain control. You stop speaking from habit. You begin speaking from intention. That is where wisdom lives. So the next time a conversation becomes quiet, resist the urge to fill every empty second. Allow the silence to exist. Let your previous words settle. Give the other person room to think. Give yourself room to think. Because silence is not a weakness. It is not awkwardness. It is not lost momentum. Used intentionally, silence becomes confidence without arrogance, patience without passivity, authority without force, and perhaps most importantly, it reminds everyone in the conversation that meaningful communication isn't measured by how much is said. It's measured by what remains in people's minds, long after the words have ended. Chapter 9. Read the room before you lead it. The keynote speaker had spent months preparing for the conference. Every slide was polished. Every sentence had been rehearsed. Every joke had been carefully placed. As he walked onto the stage, more than 1,000 people applauded. He smiled, opened his presentation, and immediately launched into the speech exactly as he had practiced. The first few minutes felt normal, but something wasn't right. People smiled politely. Few laughed. Several checked their phones. Others leaned back in their chairs with distant expressions. The speaker noticed it, yet he continued exactly as planned. He never changed his pace, never adjusted his examples, never acknowledged the audience's energy. When the presentation ended, the applause was respectful, but forgettable. An hour later, another speaker took the same stage. She stepped up to the microphone, looked across the room, then laughed softly. "I can tell it's been a long day." The audience laughed with her. She paused. "I've been sitting where you are all morning. So before we begin, let's wake ourselves up." Within seconds, the room changed. People leaned forward. Smiles returned. Phones disappeared. She hadn't started with her prepared material. She had started with the audience afterward. Someone asked her, "Did you change your presentation?" She smiled. "No, I changed my approach. I spoke to the room I had, not the room I expected." That simple idea separates communicators who merely deliver information from those who truly connect, because influence begins the moment people feel understood. Many people believe communication is about expressing themselves clearly. That certainly matters. But great communicators understand another responsibility. They pay attention, not only to their own words, but to the people receiving them. Imagine trying to have a meaningful conversation with someone wearing headphones, looking out the window, thinking about something completely unrelated. Would you continue speaking exactly the same way? Probably not. You would adapt, slow down, ask a question, wait, do something different. Yet surprisingly, many people fail to do this when speaking to groups. They become so focused on delivering their message that they stop observing the audience altogether. Communication becomes a performance, not a relationship. But communication has always been a two-way experience, even when only one person is speaking. Every audience gives feedback, not always through words, sometimes through posture, facial expressions, eye contact, energy, silence, curiosity, or distraction. The question is, are you paying attention? Imagine explaining an idea to a colleague. Halfway through, they begin looking confused. Some speakers ignore it, continuing exactly as planned. Others stop. "I may not be explaining this clearly." Let me try a different example. That simple adjustment changes everything, because people don't expect perfection. They appreciate responsiveness. One of the greatest communication mistakes is becoming emotionally attached to your script. Preparation is valuable, but preparation should never replace awareness. Think about a skilled chef. Even with the best recipe, the chef still tastes the food because ingredients change, heat changes, timing changes. The recipe provides direction. Observation creates excellence. Communication works the same way. Preparation gives you confidence. Observation gives you connection. Without observation, preparation becomes rigid, and rigid communication rarely inspires people. Another important principle is understanding emotional context. Imagine speaking to a team that has just experienced a major setback. Would you immediately launch into a highly technical presentation? Probably not. They aren't ready for information. They're processing emotion. Now imagine speaking to a group celebrating a major success. Would you begin with warnings and criticism? Again, probably not, because emotional timing matters. People receive messages differently depending on what they're experiencing. This doesn't mean changing your values. It means adjusting your delivery. A skilled sailor cannot control the wind, but they know how to adjust the sails. Great communicators do exactly that. They cannot control the emotional atmosphere, but they can respond to it wisely. Another overlooked skill is recognizing when people are mentally overloaded. Sometimes listeners don't lose interest because the topic is boring. They lose interest because their minds are full. Imagine someone explaining 5 complex ideas in rapid succession. Even if every idea is valuable, the listener eventually reaches a limit. Attention begins to fade, not because they don't care, because the brain needs time to organize information. Great communicators notice these moments. They summarize, they pause, they simplify. Sometimes they even ask, does this make sense so far? Not because they're uncertain, because they're checking whether the audience is still with them. That habit creates partnership. People feel included rather than lectured. Questions play a powerful role here. Many speakers treat questions as interruptions. Great communicators treat them as guidance. A thoughtful question reveals something important. It tells you where confusion exists, what interests people, what concerns them. Questions are not obstacles, they're maps. Imagine giving directions to someone. Halfway through, they ask, wait, which street comes first? An impatient communicator might say, I'll explain later. A thoughtful communicator realizes something. If one person is confused, others probably are too. The question becomes an opportunity to improve clarity for everyone. Listening to the room requires humility. You must accept that your original plan may not be the best plan anymore. Many people resist this. They fear adapting will make them appear unprepared. In reality, the opposite is true. Flexibility often signals mastery. An experienced musician can improvise. An experienced athlete adjusts during the game. An experienced communicator adapts during the conversation. Not because they abandoned preparation, because preparation gave them the confidence to adapt. There is another subtle habit that builds connection. Matching the audience's level, not speaking down to them, not speaking above them, meeting them where they are. Imagine explaining personal finance to someone who has never invested before. Using technical language may impress experts, but it will confuse beginners. Now imagine explaining advanced investment strategies to experienced professionals. Using only basic concepts, they'll quickly lose interest. The message must fit the listener, not the speaker's ego. This requires empathy, the willingness to ask, what does this person need right now? Instead of, what do I want to say? That shift changes everything, because communication stops being self-centered. It becomes service. The best teachers understand this instinctively. They don't measure success by how much they covered. They measure success by how much students understood. Likewise, the best leaders don't measure success by how much they spoke. They measure success by how clearly people can move forward afterward. Connection always comes before persuasion. People are far more willing to accept ideas when they first feel seen. A simple smile, a thoughtful pause, a question asked at the right moment, a story that reflects the audience's experience. These small moments quietly build trust, and trust makes every message stronger. So before your next conversation, before your next meeting, before your next presentation, remember that you are never speaking into empty space. You are speaking to human beings, people carrying invisible worries, private hopes, different experiences, different expectations. If you learn to notice them, if you learn to adjust without losing yourself, your communication will no longer feel like a speech. It will feel like a conversation. And conversations, not performances, are where lasting influence is truly born. Chapter 10. Make powerful communication a daily habit. Every morning at exactly 6:30, before the office filled with conversations, before emails began arriving, before meetings appeared on the calendar, an elderly executive sat alone at his desk. There was no audience, no presentation, no microphone, only a notebook. Every day, he opened it to a blank page. Then he wrote one simple question: what kind of communicator will I be today? Some mornings he wrote, "Today I will listen more than I speak." Other mornings, "Today I will slow down before answering difficult questions." Sometimes, "Today I will make one person feel truly understood." The exercise took less than 5 minutes. For years, his assistants thought it was simply another personal ritual, nothing more. Then one afternoon, a newly promoted manager asked him a question. "How do you always seem to know exactly what to say?" The executive smiled. "I don't." The young manager looked surprised. "I practice how to think every single day." He closed the notebook. People believe confidence appears in important moments. It doesn't. It is built during ordinary ones. That answer reveals perhaps the greatest secret of communication. Nobody suddenly becomes an exceptional communicator. They become one conversation at a time, one habit at a time, one ordinary day at a time. Throughout this audiobook, we've explored many different principles: clear thinking, calm authority, purposeful language, strong structure, meaningful action, emotional awareness, trust, silence, reading the room. At first, these ideas may seem like separate skills, but they are not. They are different expressions of the same habit: intentional communication. Great communicators rarely rely on talent. Talent may help someone begin. Habits determine how far they go. Imagine learning to play the piano. The first lesson feels awkward. Your fingers hesitate. Simple movements require complete concentration. But after months of practice, those same movements become natural. You no longer think about every note. You simply play. Communication follows exactly the same pattern. At first, pausing before speaking feels uncomfortable. Choosing words carefully feels slow. Listening deeply requires effort. But with repetition, these behaviors stop feeling like techniques. They become part of who you are. This is why consistency matters far more than intensity. Many people become inspired after reading a great book, watching an incredible speech, listening to a powerful audiobook. For a few days, they speak differently, think differently, act differently. Then, life becomes busy. Old habits quietly return. Nothing changes. Real transformation doesn't happen because of one emotional moment. It happens because of repeated action. Small improvements, repeated consistently. Imagine improving just one conversation every day, one better question, one calmer response, one thoughtful pause, one stronger ending. Those changes may feel almost invisible, but over a year, they become extraordinary. This is how remarkable communicators are built, not through dramatic breakthroughs, through ordinary discipline. Another mistake people often make is waiting until important moments to practice. They prepare for the interview, the presentation, the negotiation, the difficult conversation. But communication isn't a performance you occasionally deliver. It's a way of living. Every conversation becomes practice. Ordering coffee, talking with a family member, answering a phone call, greeting a neighbor, speaking with a cashier, listening to a friend. These moments seem insignificant, yet together they shape your communication far more than the occasional speech ever could. Because habits don't recognize importance. They simply repeat whatever you practice most often. If you rush through ordinary conversations, you'll probably rush through important ones. If you interrupt friends, you'll likely interrupt clients. If you avoid listening at home, you'll struggle to listen at work. Every conversation teaches your brain what normal feels like. Choose that normal carefully. One of the most valuable habits you can develop is reflection. At the end of each day, ask yourself 3 simple questions. What conversation went well? What could I have handled better? What will I improve tomorrow? Not to criticize yourself, not to chase perfection, simply to become more aware. Awareness always comes before improvement. Athletes review game footage, musicians listen to recordings, pilots study every flight. Great communicators also learn from experience. They don't assume every conversation was successful simply because nobody argued. Sometimes the most important lessons come from moments that felt ordinary. Perhaps someone misunderstood your message. Perhaps you interrupted without realizing it. Perhaps you solved a problem by asking one thoughtful question. Those moments become teachers, if you're willing to notice them. Another essential habit is protecting your curiosity. Many people believe expertise means having all the answers. In reality, the wisest communicators continue asking questions. They remain students, no matter how experienced they become. Curiosity keeps conversations alive. It prevents arrogance. It reminds us that every person knows something we do not. The moment you stop learning from people, you begin losing your ability to connect with them. There is also tremendous value in slowing down. Modern life constantly rewards speed, faster emails, shorter meetings, instant replies, immediate opinions. But meaningful communication often grows at a different pace. Relationships require time. Trust requires consistency. Understanding requires patience. The strongest conversations are rarely rushed. Think about someone whose words have deeply influenced your life. Perhaps a parent, a teacher, a mentor, or a close friend. Did they change you through one perfect sentence? Probably not. They changed you through countless conversations, consistent presence, reliable guidance, repeated kindness. Influence is almost always cumulative, small moments, repeated over time. Finally, remember why communication matters in the first place. It isn't about sounding impressive. It isn't about winning every argument. It isn't about becoming the smartest voice in the room. Communication exists for something much greater: to reduce misunderstanding, to build trust, to solve problems, to strengthen relationships, to help people feel seen, heard, and understood. Those goals never go out of style. Technology will continue changing. Workplaces will evolve. Industries will transform. Artificial intelligence will become more capable. Information will become easier to access. But one thing will remain remarkably valuable: the ability to connect with another human being. Clearly, calmly, honestly. Because in a world filled with endless noise, clarity becomes rare. In a world filled with constant distraction, presence becomes unforgettable. And in a world where everyone wants to be heard, the person who truly knows how to listen will always stand apart. So as this audiobook comes to an end, remember that becoming an influential communicator is not a destination. It is a lifelong practice. Every conversation gives you another opportunity, another chance to think more clearly, to speak more intentionally, to listen more deeply, to lead more wisely. You don't need perfect words. You don't need a perfect voice. You don't need perfect confidence. You simply need the willingness to improve, one conversation at a time. Because every meaningful relationship, every successful career, every inspiring leader, every unforgettable teacher, every trusted friend is built upon the same quiet foundation: the ability to think clearly, speak with purpose, and leave people better than you found them. And if you continue practicing these principles, not only will your conversations change, your relationships will deepen, your confidence will grow, your opportunities will expand, and perhaps most importantly, the way people remember you will change forever. Not because you spoke the most, but because every time you spoke, your words truly mattered. The end. Conclusion: the conversation that changes everything. Before we say goodbye, I'd like you to imagine one final scene. Many years from now, someone asks a question about you, not about your job. not about your achievements, not about how much money you earned. They simply ask, what was it like to talk with them? What do you hope the answer will be? Perhaps they'll say, whenever they spoke, everything became clearer. Or, they never made me feel small. Maybe, I always left our conversations feeling more confident than before. Or simply, they truly listened. When people remember us, they rarely remember every word we said. They remember how we made them think, how we made them feel, how we made them see themselves. That is the real legacy of communication. Throughout this audiobook, we've explored 10 principles. Think before you speak. Stay calm under pressure. Choose words carefully. Organize your ideas. Lead people toward action. Control your emotional tone. Earn trust. Respect silence. Read the room. And practice these skills until they become part of who you are. Each principle is valuable on its own, but together, they create something much greater. They shape the kind of person others naturally want to follow. The truth is, influence has never belonged to the loudest person, or the smartest, or the most charismatic. Real influence belongs to those who consistently make other people feel understood. Every meaningful relationship, every successful leader, every trusted mentor, every unforgettable teacher has mastered one simple habit. They communicate with intention. They don't speak to impress. They speak to connect. They don't argue to win. They listen to understand. They don't chase attention. They earn respect. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Communication isn't a performance. It's a responsibility. Because every conversation leaves something behind. It either creates confusion or clarity, distance or trust, fear or confidence. Every sentence becomes a choice. And those choices quietly shape the quality of your relationships, your career, your opportunities, and ultimately, your life. So starting today, don't try to master every principle at once. Choose just one. Pause before answering. Listen a little longer. Speak a little more clearly. Remove one unnecessary word. Ask one thoughtful question. One small improvement repeated every day will eventually become a completely different way of communicating. And one day, without even realizing it, people will begin responding differently to you. Meetings will become easier. Conversations will become deeper. Disagreements will become calmer. Opportunities will appear more often, not because the world changed, but because the way you communicate with the world changed. Remember, your voice is more than sound. Your words are more than language. Every conversation is an opportunity to leave someone a little more hopeful, a little more confident, a little more understood than they were before they met you. Thank you for spending this time with me. If these ideas stayed with you, don't let them remain only ideas. Practice them, live them, share them, because the most powerful conversations are still waiting for you. Until next time, keep thinking with clarity, keep speaking with purpose, and keep becoming someone whose words truly matter. Thank you for listening.